rights, and that inclusion is the promise of progress. However, this promise is ensconced in the same logics that deploy women's rights and LGBTQ rights to expand and aggrandize carceral imperial regimes. For example, in the validation of war and the invasion of countries like the United States has done, and feminists have critiqued the sort of Western white saviorism of saving brown women from brown men, or in more recent contexts in terms of identifying Islam as inherently homophobic and thus fueling Islamophobia and wars against Muslim countries and people. Or what I'm more familiar with in the post-Cold War period, human rights have expanded a carceral regime of border enforcement and control and intensified the criminalization of survival, creating what many of us in this field call carceral human rights. This is very evident in the anti-trafficking sphere. But how does this question, are human rights obsolete, relate, if at all, to contexts where even bad human rights would be better than avowedly anti-human rights policies? There is no doubt that anti-LGBTQ and anti-gender policies in some of the countries that continue to bring us collectively together as area specialists. Yet even when progress is advanced through anti-human rights policies, and thus supposedly absent of dynamics like homo-nationalism or pinkwashing, it is nonetheless imperative to consider how gender and sexuality are entangled in nationalist and colonial designs. In this way, regressive laws regarding gender and sexuality are part and parcel of nationalist or civilizational progress narratives. While Russia receives too much attention, and I agree and defer to colleagues whose expertise alter the order of things in our area studies, I think still that how Russia is studied when it is studied matters too. Russia receives a lot of attention because of its anti-LGBTQ policies. Indeed, its anti-human rights stance is elevated to levels of national security. The continued passage of anti-LGBTQ policies in Russia, notably amidst a deranged and messianic war against Ukraine, are central to its ethno-civilizational designs, to its progress narrative. The vilification of gay rights and anti-LGBTQ investments are central to its ethno-civilizational project that seeks to, among other things, eliminate indigenous language learning and indigenous cultural survival, to create a permanent liminality and precarity for racialized labor migrants, and to enact global civilian and military terror, not only in Ukraine since 2014, but also Georgia, Syria, Chechnya, and looming threats against Moldova. If anti-LGBTQ policies are, thus, if anti-LGBTQ policies are in service of more than preserving the norms of cis heteronormativity, then the focus on LGBTQ rights necessarily involves parsing through the racial and colonial investments in which they are entangled. So to conclude, while I am critical of human rights, I'm not pessimistic about imagining and working towards greater livability, and not just for humans. I think a question like, are human rights obsolete, expands what can come into focus when we turn to LGBTQ rights. And so this leads me to kind of the broad questions of, what are then the remedies for regressive policies or these illiberalism? Is liberalism the solution to illiberalism? And if not, then homo-nationalism is certainly not the barometer of freedom or even the compromise solution to exclusion. Thanks. Thank you very much, Jennifer. That was you mentioned earlier in our preparation meeting that your comments would be around 8-10 minutes, and you were exactly right. And I must say, I did not keep my promise to introduce you in a more elaborate way just before you started speaking. So since we have a minute, so I'll do that. And I invite our participants online to go have a look. These are actually the biographies I'm reading to you are actually shorter versions of longer biographies that you can have a look at on the events page. So you can have access to all the latest publications. So that being said, as I think our audience could understand, Jennifer's research broadly focuses on human rights and how categories of harm emerge and circulate within geopolitical and colonial relations and gendered, sexual, and racial formations. She has ongoing research, which includes a book manuscript on the anti-trafficking moniker, modern-day slavery, on sexuality and race within nationalist discourses in Russia. She's also involved in community and museum-based projects on mass incarcerations and labor exploitation. So fine, I kept my promise. I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to introduce now our second speaker, Piero Recepi. As I mentioned, research fellow at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at UCL. He is the author of a very recent publication, White Enclosures, Racial Capitalism and Coloniality Along the Balkan Route, published at Duke University in 2023. Please, Piero, the floor is yours, and I will notify you after 10 minutes, right?
Thank you, Hélène, and thanks to everyone for the invitation. I'm really honored to be in the same panel with Jenny, in part because so much of my work is informed by her work, and similar critical area studies scholars like Jenny and Neda Tanasovska, but also Tjashan Kansler and Marina Grzinic, who in the 2000s questioned the deployment of sexual and gender rights to the expansion of EU borders and market reforms in former socialist countries in Eastern Europe and Russia. And so my work has mostly focused on the Balkans and the ways in which LGBT politics have been deployed to structure not only citizenship in the context of post-war Bosnia and Kosovo, but also the politics of race and racism, migration, and particularly Islamophobia, and how this introduction of LGBT rights as the ultimate test to Europeanness has been used in the last 20 years as a dog whistle for policing Muslim communities as innately homophobic and transphobic and incompatible with liberal norms of sexual rights. And most of this is covered in my book. But I also, in doing this, I was also interested in tracking and understanding queer and trans histories in the region that are overlooked by categories of gender and sexuality that fall outside of the Eurocentric conceptualizations of consent, dissent, or transgression. And so I was also interested in the life of queerdos and weirdos and freaks and neurodivergent people who experimented the limits of everyday life and freedom in the late Ottoman Empire and early post-Ottoman formation of nation state, and how those bodies and those people and those communities became the targeted object against which new forms of binary citizenship and gender was created. So more recently, I am interested in how LGBT organizations that were once sponsored and funded by predominantly US and EU, not only governmental, but also non-governmental funding. And as you all very well know, those things are never clear cut. I mean, they either reinforce each other or they all come from the same source and with the political aim, similar political aim, have come under various forms of censorship and pressure as to what their activities can engage, which in the last year, since the beginning of the genocide in Palestine, a lot of these organizations have organized various events in solidarity with Palestine, including connecting live with queer activists in Palestine, to have conversations and discuss forms of solidarity and what could queer people in Kosovo or Bosnia or more broadly in the Balkans do in solidarity with queers in Palestine. And so as I became part of this network of organizing in solidarity with Palestine, it became obvious that a lot of people were being threatened at work. A lot of partners of people who were not directly involved with these initiatives were being threatened at work by organizations that ostensibly promote the kind of human rights that Jenny so brilliantly critiqued. And so we're talking here about Friedrich Naumann Stiftung, Rosa Luxemburg, EU, USAID, NDI, and so forth. And so all these organizations for whom local LGBT organizing has been crucial in not only maintaining an organization as a public representation of sorts for LGBT rights, but also in providing basic services to the queer communities, from health and HIV testing to prevention materials and training of psychologists and so forth. And so one thing that is becoming increasingly obvious is that if in the last 20 years, there was no question about the alignment of queer politics with the EU project in particular, that's increasingly changing. And I welcome that change because I think it kind of illustrates in a more blatant way the contradictions of liberal human rights. And it asks queer activists, academics, people to grapple with the reality of what does those rights really mean in the broader context of what Jenny said, the criminalization of survival. And that term really stuck with me. And so what does it mean to speak of gay, lesbian, trans, non-binary lives in the context of a criminalization of survival, in the context of necropolitics at borders? And I think the one image that was, I think, a turning point for so many queers was the image of Israeli soldiers with a gay flag in Gaza over destroyed homes and very likely bodies of other people, with the inscription that they had gone there to liberate Palestinian gays from Hamas. And this rings true to so many people who, especially queer people, who grow up in Muslim majority communities where the arrival of LGBT rights has always come with some sort of a disciplinary violence instrumentalized to promote Islamophobia in the name of gay rights. And so that's what I'm interested in at the moment. I'm not sure where my research is going because I just published this book, and I also want to take some time to breathe and write and think when I have something to say, because I also feel that we're so bombarded with overproduction and having to constantly come up with new things to say when we may not necessarily have anything. And so I'm just sharing my thoughts of what I'm exploring at the moment, and I'm not sure what to make of it, other than I'm happy that these contradictions are becoming more visible, and that it's going to be increasingly more difficult to use the veneer of liberal human rights for meaningful transformations for not just queer communities, but life itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Piero. Well, our panelists are quick, also 8 minutes. We'll have more time for discussion. Thank you for sharing these thoughts. I think, yeah, your work resonates very well with Jennifer's discussing larger issues related to the conceptualization of human rights and of justice, right? Yeah, very engaging. And I think we will move, I mean, these are very important questions and that are manifested in more specific contexts as well, which we will see with now, we will address with our last two speakers. So I want to invite now Mariana Muravieva. As I mentioned, she is professor of law at Alexandru Institute, Finnish Center for Russian and East European Studies. She has worked as a researcher, trainer, and professor for academic and non-academic agencies, including the UN and NGOs. Her research is interdisciplinary and examines long-term trends and patterns in social development with a focus on normativity, gender, and violence. Some of the most recent projects focus on human rights of women and austerity, conservative jurisprudence, violence against women, and including family violence and against elders. So Mariana Muravieva, again, you can see the panelist full biography and list of publications on the events page. So Mariana, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Helena, and good evening, everyone from Helsinki. It's pretty late and raining. However, I'm happy to join my colleagues here to discuss such important issues. As Jenny, I'm pretty happy to see old friends and make new friends. And I'm actually very grateful to the organizers to invite me to join the series, as I also see a lot of familiar names. I'm very happy to see that my students also now in their capacity as grown-up researchers are part of the series. So I hope that three others, right, that we have left will also be as interesting than the previous three, and ours included. So I would like to pick from where Jennifer and Piero expressed their criticism of liberal concept of human rights and liberal understanding of human rights, and take them a little bit to the other side and sort of to be a bit less theoretical and a bit more down to the ground, to provide a little bit of the context and explanation at what and why queerness, queer rights became the center, the target, the scapegoat for authoritarian political regimes such as Putin regime. So today I'm not trying to go, as I usually do, into a big comparative picture. There have been quite a number of really important events happening in Russia and during the Russia's attack against Ukraine that expose and highlight and reveal the difficulties of the liberal approaches to human rights and what they made, how they sort of incorporated or rather failed to be incorporated into other contexts. to think about human rights of LGBTQI plus people in Russia and their development. This is not a rosy picture, and if you compare it to the human rights of women, I tended to say in the years to come that we were not that bad. Now we are awful, but we were not that bad. But actually, for the human rights of LGBTQI people, there's never been a reprieve. There's never been a situation in which we would be optimistic about queer community. Neither the 90s, when everybody was thinking that there was some potential for human rights development, and there was at least the official commitment to observe human rights, neither in 2000s and of course already in 2010s and up, human rights of LGBTQI people became one of the most policed and repressive, but also the sort of in a nutshell, the scapegoating rights. The community became a scapegoat for the Putin's regime. It's important to put the development of human rights for LGBTQI people within the context of a bigger framework, and I use cultural sovereignty quite a lot as the framework, a conceptual framework that provides quite a good explanation. And I'm sure that a lot of you know that cultural sovereignty as a concept comes from the legal anthropology studies. And legal anthropologists point out at this dichotomy between culture and rights. And I think that's what liberal human rights are weak about, the whole idea of universal versus local, and universal is better than local, although they want to be sensitive and attentive to the local, but it doesn't actually happen. And in this discourse, when localities faced with profound changes under the threat of universalization, of losing the identity of what is framed as losing their culture, the response, the lash out, the response is very much to not to accept or to reject the concept. Ironically, the Soviet Union and the Soviet heritage actually wasn't like that. The Soviet Union liked universalism and liked pretty much the whole idea of abstract universal concepts. And so it's interesting to see how that changed in the post-Soviet, especially in the Putin's times, that human rights of women and that human rights of LGBTQI people became this particular tangent, the point of contention between Russia and First Council of Europe, but then now it's pretty much everyone else. So the West, as the Russian propaganda and the governmental propaganda portrays that. And with the human rights of queer people, they also became a sort of test ground at one point for Putin's policies of violating and reducing human rights. Everybody probably knows and heard about so-called propaganda law. It's 2013 amendments to the administrative code that prohibited propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationship among minors. And it was obvious back then that the situation and the concepts that the government used when they stopped using notions such as democracy, for example, in a public discourse, and more sort of shifted to using the notions of sovereignty in a variety of spheres. It was obvious back then that some other measures were to come. And again, you have optimists and pessimists would say that, yes, we would have some other measures to come. But it took actually 10 years, almost 10 years, to logically finish the process of outlawing, right, sort of legalizing, outlawing, right, queer community with the Supreme Court's decision that was issued last year on the 30th of November 2023, that, and I cite, pronounced and recognized international public movement LGBT as an extremist organization. that is a very interesting wording, because even in the decision itself, they actually say that there is no registered organization as international public movement LGBT, and yet we recognize that is an extremist organization, and that creates something else, because from a legal point of view, of course, it's an absolute disaster in terms of a decision of the Supreme Court, but in a sort of way that the trajectory of the logic and the trajectory of the regime relying on cultural sovereignty and using, as I said, queer rights as a test field for what else we can do with the with violation of human rights. That sort of reached a logical end. And I mean, this decision is yet to be very closely scrutinized. I've read it several times now. I compared the decision with the decision of the Supreme Court when they outlawed or pronounced Jehovah's Witnesses an extremist organization, which everybody loves to remember. That I'm sorry to say, that reminded me of a Nazi policies and concentration camps when you did have queer people and Jehovah's Witnesses together in being sent to those camps because they were queer and Jehovah's Witnesses. And it's interesting for me now to try to understand what's going to be next, because application of an extremist ideologies to the movements such as LGBTQI movement logically pushes us to think that the next is feminism, and I'm actually expecting something along the lines this year or next year, that feminist international public organization, we don't know what that is, but will be pronounced an extremist movement. That is an important point, and this decision is a landmark decision. That is a very important point, because that decision actually shows the ultimate position of Putin, I'm pretty sure, and his government. Pretty much now it's under and courts and the Supreme Court's under control towards the anything that represents the other. Because the main concern, and this decision actually is quite telling, is the concern that queerness offers you something else, offers you otherness, offers you a choice. And that's also, by the way, that's why they didn't like the gender very much, because it's all, the criticism is like gender is a choice. No, gender is not a choice, right? I mean, it's a predestined biological state. And authoritarian governments don't like a choice, because then if you actually think about and actually allow people to think about their identities as a choice, then you have to allow a choice into other spheres of life. And just in my last minute, another sort of to confirm that a little bit, another legislation that came to light and big campaigns and again sort of a big backlash against the other category of rights, reproductive rights, that up to 23 Russian women, feminist women's organizations managed to contain the threat and fight over the threat of to reproductive rights. And 23 again revealed this movement in the regions when they started introducing legislation on prohibiting propaganda or enticing abortion, propaganda of abortion or enticing abortion. And that is, again, one other sort of pace that shows you that choice now is not an option. And also it fits very well with the regime's sort of idea that that there are choices, but there are only the choices that we allow you to make. And that involves, of course, human rights. And they're always the rights that we allow you to have, and then you have to receive them rather than to ask for them. And I guess that on this note, I will pass on to Catalin, who will provide, I guess, the other part of it as what I know of Catalin's research. Thank you. Questions are welcome.
Thank you. Okay, Catalin, let me introduce you properly. So as I mentioned earlier, she's professor of government and law at Lafayette College, Eastern Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on domestic violence, women's and parents' activism in Central and Eastern Europe. Her most recent publications include the Routledge Handbook of Gender in Central Eastern Europe and Eurasia, 2021, edited with Janet Elise Johnson and Mara Lazda. It was awarded a prestigious prize, 2022 Health Prize for Best Book for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Women's and Gender Studies. She is currently editing 2 books, The War on Gender, and it's 1 book. The War on Gender and the Gender of War in Central and Eastern Europe, under contract with Lexington Press. So she will mostly focus on the case of Hungary, and we can discuss, I think, in the later in the Q&A, what are the transnational ramifications of those legal changes that are taking place in Central and Eastern Europe. Katalin, please.
Thank you. I hope you can see the slides. I'm not dedicated to these slides, but they often help me organize often extremely contradictory, wide-ranging, and complex issues. So I'm going to try to do at least a few themes and issues here. And I am impressed and very glad that we had this order. First, I thought, no, we should be upfront with, the theory, and then comes the empirical. But we all combined the two. And I will first focus on concepts and also or ideological interpretations thereof, but more importantly, their consequences. And those consequences will come then to the European Union's maybe less enthusiastic embrace of the LGBTQ plus rights and regulations so that people with this affiliation could have a less discriminatory environment around them. I will indeed bring in some aspects on Hungary, some on Poland, and I'm rather glad that Mariana Moravia already noted quite many of the Russian legal contexts which enormously influence these countries' actions and behavior. My main argument is actually also deeply resonating with what she said, and that connects to the critique of liberalism, which I endorse. I think many of us can see the enormous problems, hypocrisies, maintaining of enormous inequalities. But the problem is when it's missing. So liberalism is criminal, except when it's missing, because then we badly need it. So that is one of the contradictions I want to highlight. And that also includes how, at least in the Central Eastern European and Eurasian context, dictatorships and increasingly authoritarian contexts embrace the no-choice, anti-gender and anti-LGBT framework. So no wonder sort of that the action-reaction process emerges, maybe not so deeply embraced as maybe some of my colleagues see it, that it's an oppressive mechanism. So I'm using this concept, which I came across with a discussion from the movie Origins, focusing on race and caste systems, because this is the term the director mentioned, issue of endogamy, which means a custom of marrying, living with partnership within a particular social or cultural group in accordance with custom or law. It is regulating whom we can love and who can live together, which tends to be exclusive heterosexuality, also limiting race relations, intermarriages between class, caste, country, religion, ability, or different ability. I hope you are seeing what, here should it be, but this should not be on. No subtitles, please. Okay. And I'm using this frame, which Joanna Rogulska and Sofia Vlodorczyk developed indeed in that award-winning handbook, which itself gender not only socially constructed, but it carries many of the choices, which at least under certain circumstances, at certain meaning in societies where this personal freedom may be at least partially available, there would be options between how the institutions, let it be state civil society, legislation, socioeconomic status, would allow us. So gender itself was and continues to be an analytical lens. It does move beyond the binaries. And again, many of us who have grown up, studies the Soviet model, most of us, myself included, so first focused on women's movements, and then more recently have moved on to gender, exactly because it includes more than the binary frameworks. And even here we have numerous perspectives, which is where I would like to come to. So the framework of queer has again opened up new venues, and it's not because it's the largest constituents, although it is certainly increasing when such options are available. I'm also using here Masha Gessen's interpretations, but there are many others who have looked into why are we using the Q from the LGBTQ, covering very different choices or lifestyles, and those two quite a bit contradictory frameworks is one of the more profound, saying this is how I was born, this is not something you can change, this is who I am, it's unmutability. But the second one, and probably both are highly controversial, but the second one is what many authoritarian systems fear, reject, and try to enormously regulate. And that's the issue of fluidity, that there is choice, at least to some, maybe not all, but a big majority of people who would move out of the gender binaries. As Mariana was also talking about that, which I come back into the convergence of the anti-gender framework, the information or the social freedoms affect greatly also women's lives. That includes, which the US government have done extensively, the gag order about giving information on reproductive rights, in particular abortion. So what I don't hope, but I expect that as analytical frameworks really challenge existing politics, is that sex itself is also socially constructed, but it took a long while to even recognize people who are intersex, which humanity's existence is about 2% of the population have been deeply violated physically and beyond. And here it opens up that I think dramatically new vision that both sex and gender are socially constructed. Neither one of them are immutable. And gender, and not sex thus far, has become the center of the political cultural divides. This image, which I'm showing here, is from the UT Austin's also changing labels, moving from gender and sexuality center, which has been the more dominant framework, to back again to where many analysts have been a few decades ago, and it's focusing not on gender, but on women, which is again defining binary sexism. So if I move from here, these concepts, a more concrete framework, which I hope to do, to the anti-gender framework, which many of colleagues, activists, enormous data analysts like Neil Datta's tracing of where the transnational money flows, which is US, Russian money, many other elite business organizations connecting to governments. This is a highly visible, enormously powerful and transnational movement, which selectively picks different themes, which is where I would like to go to. There is a cohesion of targets. This doesn't mean that all of these themes at the same time take place, but there is a convergence of these themes, again, limiting both individual and group freedoms to kind of be in a lockstep. And I will tell you 3 frameworks, which in particular I notice in Central and Eastern Europe, which does also include the Russian context, although it's substantially also different. So women's reproductive rights, and this has been in Poland for decades, the focus, but that has many more aspects to it, from intra-utero and all kinds of scientific insemination involvements, which the Vatican and many others have been trying to limit, despite what they perceive as demographic demands. And LGBTQ, what I call and many others call rights. And again, that's a new framing. That is a relatively new framework. I highlighted the T because it's quite a different story. Although we combine them together, they are different visibilities, also abilities to organize, but in particular the change. Sometimes one way, sometimes both ways of changing genders and affiliations, and the legalization, the acceptance of scientific and legal administrative segments have become part and parcel of this traveling framework. Marriage equality, same-sex or single-person adoption rights, itself the academic field of gender studies, no wonder from the UT Austin framework, but in Hungary, which I will hopefully get to in like a few seconds, all of the degree granting gender studies have been eliminated. And sex education in schools, and in particular for the members of the Council of Europe, the ratification of the Istanbul Convention. In particular, Poland has for a long time tried to move away from it. With the new government, that's much less likely. Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria were also constitutionally gender is not an accepted term. So here are the 3 frames which interlock, travel, resonate, and in particular, governments and political advertisements deeply change public opinion. Number 1, which is again a long historical process, enhancing self-love, you can call it nationalism, focusing on that we will disappear. Demography is destiny, especially for the relatively small ethnic groups in Central and Eastern Europe, which then connects to number 2 in a second, about hate, which I call on steroids, rejecting migration. This is where Islamophobia and xenophobia deeply has been embedded by enormous campaigns, in particular in Hungary, but certainly not only there. And these hate campaigns build on one another, enhancing resonant frame, number 1. And number 3, these institutions, and I think this one is at least as important as the first 2, making it in the very interest and life-threatening interest of people. If you don't march according to the tune of the authoritarian government, let it be the Orban regime or the PIS at that time in Poland, the institutions will make your life very difficult. And that's what happened with many LGBTQ groups, including feminist groups, that the tax authorities went after them, the foreign agent bills, all kinds of other both administrative and legal tools have been used against them with very little resistance from the broader public, in part because both from the past, the Soviet period, people know not to stick their necks out. There's also enormous propaganda machines to make these justifications further deepened, which creates yet one more dare I say contradiction, but it's only on the surface contradiction, that despite economic problems, high inflation, collapsing healthcare, education system, systematic corruption, a foreign policy which towards these countries which they supposedly want and like against the EU, and maybe less, and that's towards Russia, like in the case of Poland, it still replicates the anti-gender framework of this country. So let me stop here. Yes, there is more. Maybe one I would show, and that's the ILGA's map. And again, this is all about the EU's work-related anti-discrimination map work. And it brings all the groups together, which I find very problematic. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and intersex are not the same. They perceive very different kind of social, political, and administrative frameworks. So putting them all together in an index is somewhat unreasonable. But again, still, this is exclusively focusing on workplace and legal discrimination, which again provides a very partial framework. So let me stop. There may be some good questions about the concrete cases, which I hinted at a little bit, but I think it provides a context from how concepts really matter, how political systems mobilize them to their own long-term or longer-term survival. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. I would like to remind our participants, our audience, that they can ask questions. Please do so. You can use the Q&A box to ask questions. You might ask specific questions to speakers or more general ones that can be answered by all the panelists. So please don't hesitate to ask. I will collect some of the questions and yeah, share with the entire audience. But let me start with, so I would like to be the first to ask question. Privilege of the chair moderator. So I'm really interested. I'm a political scientist by training, I mean, like some of you on the panel. But what I found quite interesting is that so my question is about actors, political actors, yeah, because we have been I mean, our panelists have emphasized some of illiberal practices. I'm not sure we can call them like that even. Jennifer has had us, Jennifer and Piro had us rethink of what we consider liberal and just and fair and what isn't. So what about the political actors' motivations? Because some of the discussions were also hinting at transnational trends, right? That these are the deprivation of rights, yeah. So is a global trend, right? But at the same time, it's enacted by specific actors, yeah. So it might be an ideology, but it's enacted by actors, yeah. And who are these actors? So my question is that, so they can be those let's say repressive or oppressive practices, who enacts them, yeah. And is it something that actors themselves strongly believe, or they have more opportunistic, do they really abide by those illiberal ideologies, or they're completely opportunistic? So that would be one of my first question to all panelists. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Jennifer, we haven't heard you for a while now already, so maybe you go first.
I don't know. I think my colleagues have, I mean, I am a defector from political science. So I think like the question around political actors, I'd have to think about that for a moment. I don't have an answer on the ready. I mean, only just maybe one thought is to that in terms of, you know, scholarly work, I appreciate the scholarly work that has been sort of finding like quote unquote origin stories for some of this neoconservative or far right, political organizing, that the deep connections between that it is in fact, transnational, right? That no country has, made up anti-gender policy alone, right? That it's, politically expedient, from Ohio to, all kinds of places, right? So yeah, so I'll leave my comment there. I think that I'm interested in, because I'm with Mariana and Catalin, I think we all want similar things in the world, right? And so I am curious about having, a conversation about, what it is that we want in that future, right? The specific material effects, and then the kind of, conversation around, the diagnosis in some ways, that we're giving different diagnoses, or we're perhaps using slightly different terminology. And I think that would be important to have that conversation, and not as like one's right and one's wrong, but just more in like, what are these nuances, right? Because we're the ones a part of imagining this future, right? It's not a game, it's not a race, right? It's like a collective thing. And so, I invite that kind of conversation as well, maybe later, if others have questions along those lines.
Somebody else wants to intervene? Mariana, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a great question on political actors and what's the motivation behind those political actions, especially in I don't like the term liberal, so I don't think that adequately describes what's happening in say authoritarian regimes. I think that's a bit more adequate, at least in a connection with Russia, but also I guess with other countries. Political motivation, as political scientists say, is a very problematic and complicated issue. I've been doing recently a project on what kind of circumstances push us to make a certain legal choices, and of course legal choices are political choices as well, in a way that when you coming with initiative with a certain legislation, it's also a choice, as I've been saying, that no matter what kind of discussion you're having, invading Ukraine is a choice, no matter what provocation is there. And I hate all things like unprovoked attack against Ukraine. There's no unprovoked in it. I mean, provocation doesn't matter in this particular respect. I mean, we make choices, and choices are made by actors. And so I'm interested as to why these particular choices are made. For a long time, I was among those scholars who would say that in respect to Russia or Hungary or Poland, those choices were pragmatic choices, in a way that those leaders, being male, supporting patriarchy, they also made very pragmatic choices as to how to go about to support their power. And of course, a very pragmatic way of doing that is organizing a group, first of all, dividing groups, creating the narratives of victimhood, who is more victimized or less victimized in this situation, and then scapegoating certain group, which sort of across spectrum has a potential to be sort of created as an outsider to everyone. And LGBTQI plus or queer people, and that's experienced, I guess, from a lot of contexts, United States, Russia, UK, other contexts. It doesn't matter where you come from. It's unfortunately queer people who often become sort of the united scapegoat. Doesn't matter across spectrums and across sectors. You can unite women, Muslims, Orthodox, workers, educated professionals, and all that into hating or being suspicious of LGBTQI people. And in a way, so I've been thinking for quite some time. So it's been a pragmatic, way of doing that, especially for Russia. I mean, Putin is not religious. He doesn't give a damn. He's a Soviet person. He's not particularly misogynic, apart from some other sort of people in Russia who would be openly misogynic, you know, and all that. So you can't really see him as somebody who is particularly this or that. And yet, it's under his regime that he created this scapegoating, this division, this situation. So at some point, I've started thinking that there's more to it than pragmatism. There's more to it. There's also fear, and there's also an attempt to protect yourself from this fear. And I guess that would be sort of my response to that as well. And with the start of aggression against Ukraine, you can see this fear increasing, and fear also makes politicians and political actors to make certain choices and to create situations in which they try to protect their power and hold on their power by introducing more and more repressive practices. With Navalny dead, and it's obvious, I mean, okay, there's no discussion as wide to who did it, right? I mean, there's no way they're going to make a face and say, oh, as it happened with Nemtsov, you know, back in the day, oh, we really don't know. We're investigating. There's no investigation pending. It's the case closed. They announced, it's obvious what's happening. And I guess that also sort of contributes to this idea that the fear of losing power is so great, and the fear of being ousted from the system is so great that it makes to introduce more and more repressive measures. So my question then, there's logic in it. So what would be the turning point when this fear doesn't work anymore, and then it's just goes into some other type of repression that is not even supported by this? And having historical examples, that is not a good picture, as we all know. So I see that Kathleen also wants to add, so go ahead.
Yeah,
I appreciate it, and this question is unanswerable. I'm sure you know that. How would we ever know? And what people say and what they do are like awfully can be different. And also, even if what they say is true, how are we ever gonna be ever able to see the financial, God knows, other kinds of advantages as to what they said. But I do think this hate framework, just like transnationally, has been, I wish political marketing would not be this awfully apt. I mean, literally from the quantitative to the qualitative level, the forces are much more integrated than probably the 5 of us here could ever be. These frameworks, and I don't have to imagine, these are actual people traveling and bringing some of these ideas. Some are tested in smaller circles, some are in others. But if I just look into this previous book, if you let me show just the cover, which I'm rather proud of, that is on parental movements, which I had the privilege to work with Elżbieta Korolczuk. And on the cover of that book, I hope some of you may have seen, there is this couple who are so, I don't question that they truly believe that gender is a dynamite, which is in danger, which is bringing up not just their family, but what they see as their immediate social context and environment and country. And many, we call them parental because these were mostly women, nearly exclusively women, but they wanted to have a gender neutral framework, which then the church and the state were happy to travel with, and from funding, which is enormous. So in one hand, you're shoving down all those annoying, framed as horrible, unacceptable beings who are in a wrong path and they should be re-educated, LGBTQ+, and at the same time elevating the ones with money to the gazoo, space to the gazoo, rhetorics to the extreme, that's the good thing. I mean, most people want to survive, as Violetta's question also implies. They're enormous traumas of many, many kinds. One of them is just make it through the next day. And they're not clearly on the color scheme, we often want to see them. So some of these gender equality frameworks for men who have been literally put into very difficult conditions, economic and social otherwise, those will not ever be feeling like a liberatory framework. It's going to be extremely difficult to get a broader acceptance when their lived experience is extremely different. So there are multiple layers here, which doesn't make it complicated. They're all addressable, but that's where more voices than, the dominant authoritarian enhanced framework comes in. So these are long processes. I don't think the important part is to know which one is honest, which one is not, but the structure and the framework and the legitimation, the sovereignty argument, which Russia has been using, Hungary and Poland as well, has been deeply questioning the kind of traveling transnational framework, which many people are living not just on their telephones, but also in the norms and the type of culture what they're living. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Peter, do you want to react? And then we will move on to the, we have a question in the Q&A, Violetta. I haven't, I have seen your question, and and I see a second question. I might collect them and ask specific questions to our panelists. But Peter, please.
I mean, I'll start by telling a joke that circulated in the 90s in the Balkans. And the joke goes, a teenage son goes to his mom and says, "Mom, I'm gay," anywhere in the Balkans. And the mom slaps him and says, "No, you're not gay. Elton John is gay. You're just homosexual." And so I think when we try to kind of think of where homophobia comes from, or transphobia, or misogyny, and how it's instrumentalized, especially in the post-Cold War moment, but also during the Cold War, we cannot assume that like the masses are naturally homophobic and autocrats somehow tend to their whims, and that's how it works. I mean, LGBT rights were instrumentalized heavily in Eastern Europe in the larger processes of market reforms, in creating a very particular kind of cisgendered, wealthy, able-bodied homosexual who represented the LGBTQ movements, who received usually money from various foreign organizations. And so this is not to kind of guilt trip those people who had been part of those movements, but to create a kind of situated reality of where this comes from and how this emerged. And so rather the LGBT community wanted it or not, they were, along with other communities, depending on the political context in each part of post-socialist landscape, they became targeted as vulnerable communities to kind of promote particular liberal ideas and market-based ideas of what it means to be to acquire free sexuality, to choose your desire, to choose your path to citizenship, and so forth and so on. And so your question of where this comes from, I mean, because I think the original question was where the violence comes from. I think that's what you asked, right? And so my other response to that question is, I mean, let's look at Palestine, right? Where does the violence come from, right? It comes from $3.3 billion a year of US sponsoring weapons, right? To genocide an entire population. And so when people ask the questions of like, where does violence come from? I mean, it's multi-sourced, but I mean, it's also, we cannot play games and choose where we choose to kind of think of liberalism in terms of LGBT rights and where we think of liberalism in terms of bare life and survival. right? And I think my standing displeasure with area studies is that its spatial and temporal categories always create, you know, the perfect subjects, which is generally Western European and Western European democracies, the nearly perfect subjects that could become human if they tried enough, which is generally post-socialist landscape, and the abject others who are always located somewhere in the peripheries of these former first, second, and third worlds. And so without us expanding our thinking to think of the world beyond these very strictly US State Department defined area studies goals, it's impossible for us to answer questions like that or to even address questions like that, because then we come up with very simplistic answers like, oh, it comes from Viktor Orban and he's an autocrat, and, you know, Hungarians are misogynistic and that's it. Well, I mean, wasn't it the West that actually empowered Viktor Orban? I mean, those are very complicated stories of how we came to this state of um, disaster in which we are. And I think it would be wrong to just apply a problem solution imperative to finding culprits and victims, and like think more critically about the structural forms in which LGBT rights are instrumentalized, that usually frequently don't benefit them, but actually put them in a far more vulnerable situation. I'm just stop there because I think I'm taking too much space. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I understand. But at the same time, and it leads me to some of the questions that we have here. Because if you want to, I mean, the Violetta's questions is more about focused, and she mentions actually something, and we Mariana briefly mentioned, but yeah, so the news about the death of Alexei Navalny today, which created a wave of shock, I think, among observers and people who care in general. So yeah, she says she's finding it a bit difficult to focus on academic talk, because the question, I mean, that I see here are more about resistance. Yeah, so what do you resist then? Yeah, if there are no actors, if you cannot pinpoint the actors, who and how do you resist? Violetta's question is more about Russian academia, which is, if I understood correctly, a quite oppressive environment at the moment, especially after the beginning of the war. Alexandra is also asking, Alexandra Novitskaya is asking, yes, how about resistance? Yeah, she's curious about. They're curious about the how do you resist those practices that are oppressive? Yeah, and then I go back to my question: if there are no actors, then who do you act against? Yeah, or what do you act against? How is resistance possible? Yes, please, Katalin.
Jenny, just go ahead. If you can start, and then I come back. Jenny.
Oh, that's either way.
Jenny, go ahead.
Okay. I guess one thing I'd like to just contribute to the conversation is, so I don't think that's the absence of actors. I think it's, again, like the formulation of what the problem is, right? And so I'm just, thinking, like, I understand, I totally understand. And as a queer person myself with relative privilege, I don't, but at the same time, I don't live unscathed by, a society, that is fundamentally homophobic. And so, I don't think the solution is necessarily more liberalism, and I don't think it's because liberalism isn't just something to improve upon, right? And so what I would say is, like, in terms of resistance and what have you, you know, I think I've been inspired by, you know, some of, you know, other activists and academics who, for example, Lesia Pohulich, who's a Ukrainian scholar, feminist scholar, who just wrote a wonderful dissertation about the way that the sort of state recognition of LGBTQ rights in Ukraine sort of have facilitated the increase of anti-Roma policy. And so, you know, she spends a lot of time in one chapter in particular analyzing all of the process that the city of Kyiv went through in order to make it ready for the Eurovision contest, you know, years ago. And that included, you know, the forced removal of Roma people from the city to pretty it up, right? And to take away, you know, what the Roma population there. And also, you know, the temporary rainbowing of, you know, the arc of friendship. You know, and it's a wonderful dissertation, and other pieces are being published associated with that. So I invite, you know, folks to look at that. And so again, it's not saying that the lives, the materiality of the lives of queer people don't matter, right? It's about, like, how are we diagnosing the problem, and you know, what all is involved in that, right? And so, you know, I don't think that, I mean, just another brief example is that, you know, recently I saw that this young trans woman who was seeking asylum in the Netherlands, Antonia Babkina, she was denied in the Netherlands, right? Supposedly like one of the most progressive or progressive places, you know, was denied medical care and access to mental health medications. And she recently died by suicide. And so again, like, where is safety, right? Clearly the Netherlands wasn't safe. Neither was Russia safe, where she was fleeing from. So, you know, just a couple of examples there. And then perhaps the last thing I would say is just that, you know, I think that sort of the absence of liberalism, you know, the need for better lives, right, for all kinds of people, you know, that I think sometimes, like, the critique or the absence of that shores up liberalism itself. And so I think that even goes back to the kind of like Cold War binary logics that have been very difficult for, like, for example, the Western media to divest of, right? But, you know, I always go back to the Susan Buck-Morss book, Dreamland and Catastrophe. I think that, you know, that piece was really brilliant for reorienting how it is that, like, the Cold War mentality of the binary really sort of misses the way in which these projects were deeply entangled. Not to say that there aren't sort of important differences, but that they are in some ways logically intertwined.
Thank you.
All right. I'm glad you spoke first. I appreciate all those references, but my question or critique to this framework saying it's where is they safe? No, we're perfectly safe. That may be a fallacy. And also our ability to highlight the problems is coming from liberalism, which is not perfect. The expectation of perfection is in my eyes, highly problematic. The same thing, maybe we are incredibly privileged in academia, but at the same time also incredibly precarious, in case none of you noticed that. I find either of those extremes problematic, the same way when I 94 started my research in Hungary, saying there are no women movements, and then you look a little bit and I found 100. They were all debating, they were all hiding, they were not in the main journals, but they are important, and maybe some survived. And also I find very reasonable criticism, and I think they're absolutely necessary, both on the global and a very concrete setting. But there was no LGBTQ plus rights and frameworks, as limited they are in the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights. And these are thin frameworks. That's what many of the women's groups have argued. But when we have something, we can hang on to that. And when it's gone, then it's a huge problem. So I would love to show something for Alexandra Novitskaya's question, and there's a bit more on that screen, obviously, than you probably need to know. But what I'm really highlighting is one of the many well-established ex-Soviet periods humor. And again, this book, A Fairy Tale for Everyone, became deeply advertised because a female ultra-right nationalist politician shredded it publicly, which looked very similar to like the Nazi book burnings. And as you see, the stories there are the unusual fairy tales, the rewritten fairy tales. So it got so much more attention and focus, and the editor got much more recognition. And many of the contemporary groups, which have been literally been eliminated because of the attack of this increasingly authoritarian system. And I do want to question Piro's interpretation that the West has enabled him. He has plenty autonomy to choose where the hell he's going, especially now, meaning Prime Minister Orban. So to blame the West for what he is doing, which I do see that has some elements to that, but it's certainly not the 100% reason as to why this country has gone so unexpectedly to many on the much more dictatorial and limited democratic political environments. I have no idea how ever it will be able to go back. See at the constitutional issues what Poland is facing now. So in addition to humor and publications, and again, yes, the gender studies programs have been eliminated, the degree granting ones. That doesn't mean that there are nobody in Hungary who would not do the research, but you won't get money, or you would have to label it differently. And it's much more challenging. And the other one is the LGBTQ community, whatever diverse they may be, and the enormous debates, has become a rallying cry for democracy. And the government, along with many others who control an enormous part of the media and legislature and schools and name it, will tremendously limit and increase homophobia and all kinds of rejections. That's what they did with migration. And these are divided communities when you throw different images at it and particular news items, then that particular resistance will increase. But there's a relative, not sui generis division in these countries, which happen from the US to many other parts of the world. So again, just challenging the homogenization of any country or politics. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Mariana, you want to say a few words? We have very few minutes left, about 2 minutes left for final. The question about Russian academia. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to answer that one. So I'm going to respond to the practices of resistance. And I would like to respond to the practices of resistance, not as a academic, but as an activist who's been in the movement for a long time, LGBTQI movement a lot. Neither Russians nor Ukrainians nor Palestinians, for that matter, in this very moment has a luxury to define the question or to think about what it is that liberalism or whatever it is. They do what they do to resist, despite what's happening. They still go out to the streets. They end up in prison. They die in prison. That's what Navalny did. They organize LGBTQI actually community in Russia. People still stay despite the decision on extremism. Young women go to women whose husbands were drafted to go to Ukraine and work with them under the threat of going to prison, etc., etc. And Ukrainians who are under attack every day do resist, they do go to the army, women enroll in the army, they do everything they can to resist the global, in their opinion, because that's what's happening with them, they think about it in a global scale. And I guess that it's just, I want to highlight that the one conversation we have as academics, you know, and our conversation is theoretical, the other conversation is people having on the ground. And while you are part of both conversations, it's extremely difficult, I have to say, to stay an academic and to try to tell them, oh yeah, we have to, you know, nobody, the usual answer to that, I don't want to, it's polite company, right? I don't want to repeat that, but I would like to remind ourselves that a lot of us who've been participating in activism, there is probably a time when you have to put academia aside and just remember that as a human being, you have a capacity to resist and to do what's right. And I think that that's the point now. So we're doing what's right.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And Piero, you had a praise in the Q&A for your comments. I see. Shoot out to Piero for his final statement. So I will hand now the microphone to Emma, who wants to remind us a few reminders. But yeah, a great panel. Thank you for everybody for participating. Thank you.
Yeah, and let me reiterate my thanks to our speakers, to Jenny, Piero, Mariana, and Cataline, and of course, our moderator, Hélène, and the members of the audience for joining us here today. As a reminder, please consider attending our upcoming session, which is not next Friday, but the Friday after. That's March 1st at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, the same time we started today. That conversation will build on today's session by looking at queer studies through the lens of migration. Thanks again, and hope to see you in 2 weeks. Bye.